Good afternoon. Welcome to our second lesson in our study of knowing God, our study of God. Last time we began with a biography of J.I. Packer, the author of this book that we're using as our guide in our study of who God is. And then we followed with some reflections on chapter 1, specifically where we heard Packer teach us that there is nothing so humbling and comforting as the study of God. That's how we should approach the study of God, recognizing that there is nothing so humbling and comforting. Now we move on to chapter 2, where J.I. Packer encourages us to think about whether we are people who know God. At the beginning of our study of God, J.I. Packer invites us to ask, am I a person who knows God? This is an important question and a good one to ask. J.I. Packer, as your parents might can elaborate later, he gives 4 characteristics. He lists 4 characteristics of those who know God. First, those who know God have great energy for God. Second, those who know God have great thoughts of God. Third, those who know God have great boldness for God. And fourth, those who know God have great contentment in God. I would draw your attention to some living pictures of such people that we have in the book of Acts. God has given us, in the book of Acts, God has given us living pictures of people who know God. For instance, in Acts 4 verse 13, we hear about how the Jews and how they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, common men. And they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. Peter and John knew God, and it showed in their boldness. So too, Paul and Silas later in chapter 16. There we hear that they were praying and singing hymns to God at about midnight, and the prisoners were listening to them. They were in prison, and yet they were praying and singing hymns to God because they had great thoughts of God. They knew God. And so even in prison and being physically miserable probably, yet they had great thoughts of God. They remind me a bit of Calvin from the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. At the beginning, we see Calvin and his mom. Calvin is dressed up in some kind of space superhero suit, and his mom asks him, "What's up today?" Calvin says, "Nothing so far." "So far?" "Well, you never know. Something could happen today. And if anything does, I'm going to be ready for it." His mom, probably thinking like a lot of your moms, says or thinks to herself, "I need a suit like that." The apostles, spiritually speaking, had a suit like that. It was their knowledge of God, their personal knowledge of God. And it made them bold. It gave them great energy. It led them to have great thoughts of God and gave them great contentment in God. And it wasn't just the apostles. It was other people as well. More ordinary people, such as Stephen in Acts 7. Pastor John and I will be preaching about him in the coming weeks. So I won't go into more there. You can look forward to that. But I would also point out Dorcas. In Acts 9, Luke tells us that there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity, In those days she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter rose and went with them. And when they arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. We see there this beautiful Christian woman, beautiful inside. I don't know what she looked like, but she was beautiful inside. She had great energy for God. And she glorified God not merely by being resurrected, but in her life as well. And no doubt she continued to after she was raised from the dead. So the book of Acts is full of people who knew God, who truly knew God. Next time you listen to a part of the book of Acts, listen for what a person who knows God looks like, does. And yet that's not the only place in the Bible. And not far from the only ordinary person who knew God and showed it. At the end of Paul's famous book of Romans, we hear Paul give some greetings to people that he knew in Rome, fellow believers. For instance, chapter 16 begins with Paul saying, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchreae, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints and help her in whatever she may need from you. For she has been a patron of many and of myself as well." Phoebe had great thoughts of God. She considered him better than all the earthly things she had to offer. So she gave freely because God and his kingdom was worth more. So too, we see someone who knew God later on. Verse 3, "Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well." Prisca and Aquila had great boldness for God. They knew God and as such had great boldness for God. And then a little later, greet my beloved Epaenetus, who was the first convert to Christ in Asia. Greet Mary, who has worked hard for you. This Mary clearly had great energy for God. And then greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners. They are well known to the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. More prisoners, content to suffer if needs be for Christ. People who know God are like that. Are you like that too? Or a better question, do you want to be like that? Do you want to be someone who knows God like that? People haven't stopped knowing God that way. It's not only in the Bible that we meet people who knew God that way. Up to the present day, there are people who know God like that. One of my favorites comes from church history, from a Scotsman named John Knox, very famous, a very bold preacher, bold reformer. Mary, the Queen of Scots, locked him up from time to time throughout his life, only to release him again and again because she was afraid of him. One time she released him and told him simply to lay up, to go lighter on his criticism of her. Stop being such a pest. And John Knox responded, imagine saying this to the queen who could have your head cut off. Madam, God hath not sent me to whisper pleasant things in princes' ears. John Knox knew God, and as such flattered not man nor prince. Seek to know God. Kids, seek to know God through Jesus Christ, his Son. Colossians 1:15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. John 14, verse 9, whoever has seen me, Jesus said, has seen the Father. I can tell you from personal experience that all the knowledge of God that I have gained has come by knowing Jesus. I've learned a lot about God in various ways, but really all the knowledge of God, knowing him personally, has come by seeing Jesus, and that's what has brought it all together. That's what has made all the things I've studied come to life. Will you seek to know God? Both in your ordinary life, going to church, your school studies, and whatnot. Will you seek to know God? Not merely knowing about God, but knowing God, especially as we gather from each Sunday in church. Will you seek to know God through Jesus Christ, his Son? I look forward to seeing you again next time. Next week, John will have the lesson, but I'll be back in 2 weeks as we continue to strive to know God better together.